afternoon. If you will begin to take your seats, there is more to come. If you'll begin to move to your seats, we're going to try to show you the video. We're sorry this did not work before lunch, but we think we have it pulled up now. This is the video that Jason Coker was going to show you. Jason, do you want to speak to this? Just do the jump, brother.
Thank you. This video is from the American Cancer Society that's working on Medicaid expansion in several states across the U.S. We are partnered with them in Mississippi and Alabama, South Carolina, gearing up for this next year. This is Medicaid Covers Us program where they are doing interviews with faith leaders to try to get the story out about the moral response from the religious community around health care for all. And this is one they did here in Mississippi, mostly in Jackson, and you'll see some familiar pastoral faces in this one.
I understand the mandate of the gospel is that we love one another as we love ourselves, and we care for one another in community.
We are in the inner city, and we're just in a place where we try to love people.
We begin with the dignity of the human person, with opportunities for education, work, health care.
I see way too many people who don't have health care coverage.
Mississippi, we are always, it feels like we're always the poorest state in the nation.
Mississippi ranks last in our country across many vital indicators, including health care.
Which is why I believe it is so essential that we expand access to health care in Mississippi.
For people who don't make enough money to pay for private health insurance, but make too much money to qualify for Medicaid assistance.
We have a lot of people that are working 2 and 3 jobs, chicken plants, some work in convenience stores, doing everything they can just to make ends meet.
Expanding Medicaid in Mississippi would dramatically affect over 10% of our population. Over 300,000 people would be directly affected in a positive way.
Everything depends on good health. If you're not healthy, you can't go to work, you can't provide for your family, you can't take care of your children, you can't pursue the American dream.
It baffles me why any elected official would be against it outside of pure political ideology that is disconnected from real people's lives.
My wife Jacqueline is a breast cancer survivor. I don't know how we would have got through that without health care coverage. I can't imagine what others without it would do.
Expanding Medicaid would give people the opportunity to get the health care that they need.
This is not a political issue. It's just not political. This is a moral issue.
It is really deplorable that hard-working, working-class people cannot get good health coverage because they can't afford it. We can do better.
As a religious leader and as a religious human being, I am indebted to my sisters and brothers, and their well-being is caught up in mine.
We learn in Scripture that we are called to care for the most vulnerable among us. And that is not an opinion, that is a mandate from Jesus.
It is our duty to our fellow human beings, made in the image and likeness of God.
Expanding access to health care in Mississippi would be an act of love consistent with his teaching.
It would be a profound moment in the state of Mississippi for our elected officials to do the right thing for them.
Expanding access to health care through Medicaid is the right thing to do. It is the Christian thing to do. I wish more of our politicians understood that.
Wouldn't access to care be a way to tell everybody you matter?
Step into Wix Studio, where
Good afternoon. My name is David McCoy. I am a retired clergy with the United Methodist Church. And it is my distinct honor, privilege, and pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Dan Jones. He served as 16th Chancellor of the University of Mississippi from 2009 to 2015. Before serving as Chancellor, he served as the University Vice Chancellor for Health Affairs and Dean of the University of Mississippi School of Medicine. He has a long association with the university, first as a medical student, beginning in 1971, a resident in internal medicine, then as School of Medicine faculty member, beginning in 1992. His time in leadership of the University of Mississippi Medical Center was marked by rapid growth in the health system. Under his leadership as Chancellor, UM undertook a major initiative to promote diversity and experienced a major construction boom. During his tenure as Chancellor, enrollment surged more than 26%, and private giving to the university hit a record high. A native Mississippian, he graduated from Mississippi College in 1971, and after earning his MD, MDiv, and his medical degree, and completing his residency in internal medicine at UMMC in 1978. He has a private medical practice in Laurel, Mississippi, and he and his family moved to South Korea in 1985, where he served as a medical missionary for 7 years to fulfill a passion for health care service to undeserved populations. And in all honesty, he probably is here because he can do the same thing. Fulfill his passion for health care service to the undeserved populations. For more than 25 years, he has served as a medical educational consultant to the medical school in North Korea. His research activities has focused on prevention of cardiovascular disease and racial and economic disparities in health outcomes. Active in the American Heart Association, Jones was the 2007 and 2008 national president. A master of the American College of Physicians, Jones was named one of the best doctors in America from 1996 to 2008, and is a member of the Alpha Omega Alpha National Honor Medical Society. Active in church, community, civic organization, his work in racial reconciliation as chair of the board of the Alluvia Collective, formerly known as the William Winters Institute for Racial Reconciliation, has been recognized with the Mississippi Center of Justice 2015 Champions of Justice Award, and as one of 2 honorees at the 2016 Jackson Friendship Ball. He is married to the former Lydia Channel of Jackson and has 2 children and 6 grandchildren. Without further ado, would you put your hands together for me and welcome this austere and well-rounded presenter.
Thanks, Pastor.
God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pastor. So, Susanna, that exceeded your introduction from yesterday by a good bit. Introductions are important, you know, how we get started with things. Over the long span of my career, as you might imagine, I've been introduced a lot, and I've had opportunities to introduce other people. When I was in leadership of the American Heart Association, traveled a lot with colleagues who were also in leadership. And one of those was a good friend, Ray Gibbons, who was a cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic. And Ray and I found ourselves introducing each other a lot. Now, he liked to introduce me because it didn't take much time to give my educational background. It was all in Mississippi College. Sorry, Dr. Lewis. And Mississippi College, and then the University of Mississippi. And that's where all my education took place. And so when I would introduce Ray, it took a little longer. So Ray was a graduate of Princeton University, and in fact won the prize for the top student in his class when he graduated from Princeton. Went from there to Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar and received a master's degree in mathematics. When he finished that, he moved back to the States and was enrolled at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, got another master's degree in math. Why would you want to do that? And then from there to Harvard Medical School. After finishing Harvard Medical School, then he did his postgraduate training, including in cardiology at the Mayo Clinic. Now, when the audience was right, I would pause at that point and I would say, do you see a trend in his educational institutions? Do you see anything there? And of course, somebody in the audience would always say, you know, oh, gee whiz, they're just great elite institutions. But I would say, well, let me give you the Mississippi look at that. Think about this. 5 schools, not one with a good football team. So, Pastor, thank you for that great introduction and for not talking about the football teams at Mississippi College. So it is a privilege to be here. Kerry, thank you for this, and for the members of Galloway. Thank you. It's a privilege to speak in this church. I've admired this church for many years. So as you'll see in my comments today, and from my title, Has the Great Commission Church Lost Its Passion for the Great Commandment? I'm going to say some critical things about church. And I'll just say that of the churches in Mississippi that I know over the last half century, no church has done better at addressing the issues related to the Great Commandment than this church has. And so it's a privilege to be here. But as I give my remarks of criticism of the church, don't think that you're completely excused from that. None of us are doing enough. None of us are doing enough. So it's a privilege to be here with the other speakers. I've learned, I've been inspired by what's been said. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in a church. I've done a lot of public speaking over my years, but mostly in public places representing public institutions. And though I never set my spiritual life aside, I don't always have the opportunity to use my full spiritual language as I do in this setting, and so I'm grateful for that. What I will say today, I hope will be of interest to some of you, but this is one of those times where one of my purposes is to say some things that I hope you need and want to hear, but certainly it's an opportunity for me to say some things that I want to say, and I hope you will understand that. The other introductory remark I'll make is that the stories that I will tell will seem maybe to you too focused on me. I don't intend for the focus to be on me, but on the people that God put in my path over many years of practicing medicine. Finally, as a mark of the importance of this for me, in 2 weeks I'll be at a national meeting for the American Heart Association, where I'll be speaking in front of 10,000 to 15,000 people about hypertension treatment and its potential for reducing the risk for dementia. It's an important topic to me, important. It's been a big part of my research career, my clinical career over the last number of years. But even though there'll be more than 10,000 in that audience, this, for me, as I looked at my calendar, this was the more important event on my calendar because this gives me the opportunity to talk about a real passion in my life, and that is how we love other people. So today we will, in this time, continue to discuss access to health care. And in my remarks today, I will be critical of my country, my state, my profession, myself, and most importantly, my church. So because I'm going to be critical of the church, I want to minimize my risk of being misunderstood. So I'm going to do something I don't usually do in public speaking. I'm going to stick close to my notes. I hope you will understand that. So I will criticize church, including my Baptist denomination and other denominations broadly identified as evangelical. I prefer the term the Great Commission churches because the word evangelical has been usurped by the political community. Great Commission denominations include my denomination of Baptist and also includes Methodists and Presbyterians of all stripes. So while I'll be critical, let me assure you that I am a happy member of First Baptist Church of Hazelhurst, Mississippi. Though I'm frustrated by the direction of my denomination and other denominations, I'm fed and fulfilled in the fellowship of my local church. I find myself agreeing with the author David Dark, who wrote in his recently written book titled Life's Too Short to Pretend You're Not Religious. I like that title. His quote, "I can't imagine leaving the tradition into which I was born behind, but hope instead to consciously confront it, to occasionally define myself against it, and to somehow dwell faithfully, though not uncritically, within it." One other disclaimer, I don't pretend to know that I have answers for you today. I'll share some of my journey, my spiritual pilgrimage as it relates to the issue of access to health care. If my words, mainly directed at myself, encourage you to take action on this moral and spiritual issue, I'll consider it a bonus. So here we go. The call from the emergency room was not unusual for my time practicing medicine in Laurel, Mississippi from 1978 to 1985. Dr. Jones, we have a patient here who doesn't have a doctor. He has bad ulcerations on his right foot and shin. Could you come see him when you're finished with your clinic patients? Of course, I agreed to see the patient and ordered some lab work to be done while I finished with my clinic. On arriving in the emergency room a little later, it didn't take long to see the problem. The patient's blood pressure was quite high, and the glucose test showed that he had diabetes. The ulcerations on his foot and leg were draining pus. Sorry, I'm a doctor. My wife reminds me, I forget sometimes when I'm speaking to a medical audience and when I'm speaking to some other audience, sorry. He had no detectable pulse in his foot or ankle, and this 45-year-old African-American man had insufficient blood supply to his right leg. As I examined the patient, I began asking questions to ascertain his medical history. "Sir, when did you begin having problems with your leg?" "Oh, I guess a few weeks ago it started hurting when I would walk up a hill. I'm a logger and spend most of my days in the woods cutting down trees, taking them to the lumber mill. After a couple of weeks, it hurt too much to work, and then I saw the ulcers. I've been at home these last few weeks." "Well, did you see a doctor?" "No, not until today." "Did you know that you have diabetes and high blood pressure? Have you been treated for that?" "Well, about 3 years ago, I cut my hand with my chainsaw, and in this emergency room, they told me that I had diabetes and hypertension and told me to see my doctor." "Well, did you?" "Now, Doc, you know us loggers work for ourselves, and none of us have any health insurance. We can't see no clinic doctor without an insurance card. Imaging studies confirmed that there was almost no blood supply to his leg due to peripheral vascular disease, a complication of his diabetes and hypertension. The disease was too far gone to save his leg. I scheduled him for an amputation the next day in order to prevent gangrene of his diseased leg and to eventually save his life. That night at dinner, I poured out my frustration to my wife, Lydia. What kind of world do we live in? Today, I told a 45-year-old man that he was losing his right leg above his knee, and his problem was 100% preventable if only he had good management of his hypertension and his diabetes. He works 12 to 14 hours a day as an independent logger, at least he used to. Now, he will not be able to do that kind of hard manual labor, and he has no other skills and only an 8th grade education. This hardworking man didn't have access to health care because he couldn't afford private health insurance and made too much money to qualify for Medicaid. What he faces now is unemployment and likely bankruptcy from the bills that the hospital will send him for his amputation. The hospital social worker will help him apply for Social Security disability, so he'll be eligible now for Medicare. Medicare will pay for a prosthetic leg and now his diabetes and hypertension management. How insane that he has to lose his leg in order to gain access to the very health care that could have prevented the amputation. How insane is it that in the wealthiest country in the world, that this is how we manage health care for a hardworking citizen? I was disappointed in my country. A couple years later, I was examining a patient with similar risk factors for vascular disease as my logger patient. I was seeing this patient under a shade tree in South Korea. As a teenager, I'd committed to use medicine as a tool to share God's love in other parts of the world in service as a medical missionary. This 40-year-old Korean farmer, like my logger patient in Mississippi, had diabetes and hypertension. The Korean farming village where we were doing a 3-day clinic was so poor and isolated that there was literally no road to the village. We'd travel there in a four-wheel drive vehicle up the bed of a river that was dry during the dry season. As I explained to the patient that we had done a urine test and diagnosed diabetes and using a blood pressure manometer had diagnosed hypertension, I was trying to think, using my relatively new language in Korea, I was trying to think of the words to ask the patient, if I write you a prescription, can you afford to buy the medication? And then it hit me that I don't really need to understand how to say that sentence, because every citizen of South Korea has access to health care, including medications, through their national health insurance plan. There was no such situation that a patient with diabetes and high blood pressure couldn't receive care to prevent vascular disease. This was 1985 in South Korea. That night, as I prepared to sleep on the floor of a farmer's home in the village, I recalled my logger patient in Mississippi. How could it be that a country with a tiny economy compared to the United States could and would provide access to preventive care for all of its citizens? More importantly, how could it be that my country would not consider it important, moral, ethical, and necessary to provide access to health care for all of its citizens? I experienced a strong sense of shame that while scores of other countries considered access to basic health care a human right, my own the wealthiest country, did not embrace that idea. How could a nation founded mostly by Christian people and populated now by a majority of people identifying as Christian allow this injustice to exist? And how could it be that in a country with a majority of its citizens identifying as Buddhist, everyone had access to health care? In my country, access to health care was not available for millions of its citizens. Again, I was disappointed in my country. Later, another experience related to access related to access to health care brought on another deeper disappointment than the one I had in my country. On the outskirts of Busan, Korea, where our family lived and I worked as a medical missionary through the Baptist hospital there from 1985 to 1992, there was a village set aside for patients with the disease of leprosy, or Hansen's disease. Lydia and I were both curious about what we had heard about this village, and one day decided to take a visit. We were greeted there by Reverend Chun. Reverend Chun seemed pleased to have foreign guests show interest in the community. He explained that he had pastored a Presbyterian church in that village for a good number of years, helping those people with isolated, hard lives. And you, he said, how long have you been in Korea? About 3 years, I said. And what brings you here? Are you one of the Nike executives? No, I'm a physician working as a medical missionary at Baptist Hospital. When I said the word physician, Reverend Chun's eyes lit up. Are you aware, he said, leaning in, that the church has a medical clinic in this village for the treatment of leprosy, I asked? No, well, the government runs a little clinic for that. They'll test and treat for leprosy, but that's all they'll treat. They won't help with any of the other medical problems that our residents have, but especially our older patients who have problems with diabetes and hypertension. So I nodded, understanding. But the villagers can go to the medical clinics in the city for those things, right? Knowing that South Koreans had national health insurance. He responded, of course, they can go to the city, but they won't. To take the bus, well, you can imagine how difficult it is for these people. The stairs on the bus from people because of their severe deformities. And in the waiting rooms of the clinics, no one wants to sit near them. And honestly, the doctors and nurses themselves don't really want them to come to their clinics. And that's why we built this clinic here at our church. Well, that's good then. The villagers can get help at your clinic. They can get what they need. Well, not exactly. We have a clinic, but no doctor. We've hired some. We've had some volunteers, but none of the doctors have worked for more than a few weeks before quitting. I could see where this conversation was going. And I wasn't sure I liked it. And I could see that Reverend Chun could see that as well. And he backed off before he scared me off. He said, let me show you around the village a little bit and let you meet some of my church members. So here we go. I asked him on the way to one of his church members' homes, I said, how many folks live here? He said, well, about 600 people live in the village, and about 75% of those are people with leprosy. And the rest are family members who came here to live with their loved ones. When a patient is diagnosed with leprosy, the government requires them to leave their homes and come here to this village. Family members have a hard decision to make. Some, out of a sense of filial responsibility, move here with their family members. Though leprosy isn't a common disease, when most of the people in a country are congregated in one place, it seems a lot. So by that time, my 3-year experience in Korea, I'd spent a lot of time in farming villages, providing medical care. I was accustomed to seeing poverty and long neglected chronic medical problems. And this little tour of this village where the leprosy patients were living was similar to the other villages I'd visited, with 3 exceptions. First is I was shocked to see so many people with such severe deformities, including blindness, faces with noses and ears missing, club hands and club feet without fingers and toes. Most of these patients were older patients who had had the disease before there was modern medicine available for treating it. Another distinguishing factor was how welcoming and gracious all the people were to Lydia and me. Apparently, the village didn't have many visitors, and they were glad to see us. And third, there was the smell. There was no getting away from that. The nose on this Mississippi boy could tell that these people were raising chickens. You know what I mean? And they were raising a lot of chickens. So one chicken farmer who spoke to us beside his chicken house introduced himself as John Me, and went so far as to make a joke about the smell, saying that the villagers really never noticed it anymore, perhaps because they didn't have noses. So he explained that all of the chickens they had were laying hens, because the people in the city would buy eggs from them because they felt like the egg shell would protect them from the contagion of the leprosy, as they ate the eggs. And the man said, they'll take our eggs, but they won't buy anything else from us. I mulled that over as Lydia and I walked back to our car. What an ingenious solution to the public's prejudice about the people who lived in this leprosy community. As he was thanking us for coming to visit him, we thanked him for allowing us to see inside his life. As we parted, leaving the village, the smart Reverend Chun, instead of asking me if I would provide care at their clinic, asked me if I would come worship with them the next Sunday. So the next Sunday morning, instead of heading to our own Baptist church, Lydia and our daughter and son, Jennifer and Jason, and I headed over the mountain to the village. Being foreigners in Korea, my family was accustomed to looking different than most other worshipers. But in this service, our family stood out not only because of our pale skin, but because we had all of our fingers and all of our toes. One of the hymns for the worship service that day was an old familiar one, Showers of Blessings. But I've never heard it sung like it was sung that day. These worshipers with damaged bodies, living a life of isolation and discrimination, sang about their blessings with a gratitude that was palpable. Watching these worshipers struggle to kneel for prayer, stand for the hymns, and limp to the altar to receive communion was a moving experience. After the service, many of the worshipers greeted our family, and I was struck by the kindness shown to our two young children. I knew that a 10-year-old daughter and 5-year-old son in their church clothes must have been a source of joy for these villagers. But I saw too that the villagers, so often shamed by the rest of the world, took care not to frighten our children. They stayed at a distance, smiled shyly, and gave those Korean bows. They made our children feel welcome and safe in that environment. After the service and after interaction with many of the church members, Reverend Chun appeared at my side. Well, what do you think? I knew what he was asking. The answer surged out of me. I would consider it a great privilege to provide medical care for these lovely people. Reverend Chun closed his eyes in a slow blink and gave a relieved smile. I've prayed. So I said, let me have a conversation with my supervisor, and I'll make contact with you in a day or two. So the next morning, I spoke with my supervisor, requesting the opportunity to extend my community health work to include 2 half-days a month in the leprosy village. The only other resources I'd like, I said, is access to a pharmacist for the prescriptions and a supply of inexpensive generic medications. Sounds reasonable, my supervisor said, but I need to run this up the chain of command. He told me he'd phone as soon as he'd done that. But 2 days later, when he called back, he sounded tense. Dan, he said, as you no doubt noticed, the board of directors of our mission group is increasingly interested in beginning new Baptist churches. I responded, I know the increased emphasis on church planting and church growth. My supervisor continued, well, overall, I'd have to say that the mood of the board is, getting more and more conservative. Yes, I've noticed. So it seems really that what the board wants from us is to focus exclusively on adding to the number of Baptist churches that we're building here. What exactly are you trying to tell me? Because your proposed work would be with a Presbyterian church and couldn't facilitate the beginning of a new Baptist church. The board has denied you permission. But it's 2 days a month, I exploded. Not even 2 half-days. I'm sorry. The answer is no. Those villagers need our help. I feel this as strongly as I've felt anything. The board says no. If you can't guarantee a new Baptist church, you're not allowed to do it. I took a breath to steady myself, but I was angry. If sharing God's love in this country can include providing care to patients of another denomination who desperately need our care, our board has lost its way. Have they forgotten that in addition to the Great Commission, There's the great commandment that tells us to show love for people. He said nothing. I continued, just so you know, I will do this work. I'll do this on my day off. Lydia and I will buy the medicines. Lydia can count pills. I'll take responsibility for dispensing the medicine without a pharmacist. We will not be denied the privilege of doing this work. And that's what we did. We were more than happy for the opportunity to work in the village, and we were happy to do that on our own time and with our own resources. But I was sorely disappointed in my church, my Baptist denomination, and the leadership of its mission agency, my employer. Certainly I was and am deeply committed to carrying out the Great Commission. I understand it to be foundational to the mission of the church. However, I also believe that a commitment to the Great Commandment is foundational to carrying out the Great Commission. Attempts to evangelize in the absence of a foundation of love is futile and wrong. Jesus offered the example. In Matthew chapters 5 through 7, the words of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount are recorded. There he offered us the challenging words about love, to love our neighbor, to love our enemy, and to love everyone in between. Then the next chapter, chapter 8, begins with these descriptive words, when Jesus came down from the mountainside. When Jesus came down from the mountainside. Jesus came down from the mountain to show us how to take these challenging words and put them into action. Matthew records 3 encounters in chapter 8 that Jesus sought. The first, a man with leprosy was healed by the touch of Jesus. Next, a Roman centurion's child was healed with the words of Jesus spoken from a distance because of his faith. And finally, he healed Peter's mother-in-law of a fever with his touch. 3 people on the fringe of society, a leprosy patient, a leader of the occupying army, and a woman with fever. All of these, by Jewish contemporary religious custom, were to be avoided. Jesus demonstrated to us who to love and how to love in these encounters. We are to love the vulnerable, and we're to love them with action, even at our own inconvenience and our own risk. A beautiful example of how to evangelize is seen in the encounter with the paralyzed friend whose 4 friends brought him to Jesus for healing. You know the story. The story is recorded in 3 of our 4 Gospels. These 4 men would not be prevented from getting their paralyzed friend to Jesus. When the crowds blocked the way, they tore a hole in the roof and lowered their friend to Jesus. The man must have been convinced to believe that Jesus could heal him, and more by the concern of his friends for his well-being and their belief that Jesus was the answer to his problems. Seeing the man's faith, Jesus first forgave him of his sins and then went on to heal his paralysis. The man walked out of the room with a new life. Caring about the souls of people requires us to love and to care about their physical lives just as we're concerned about their spiritual lives. My experience with my denomination and its mission agency regarding work in the leprosy village was pivotal in my life course. God used this experience to allow me to explore using medicine to share his love outside a formal relationship with the church organization and in places where mission groups are not welcome. My pesky God planted questions in my mind, including, do you think I brought you halfway around the world and helped you learn the Korean language to live an easy life in the part of the Korean Peninsula already responding to the gospel? Just north of you lies 25 million Korean people living with poor access to health care and no access to the gospel. In 1991, he affirmed that direction through a 2-week experience in Iran, treating Kurdish refugees fleeing the army of Saddam Hussein. In this Muslim-controlled country, in Iran, I shared God's love through medical care with the understanding that I would be sowing seeds of evangelism. By showing concern for the physical well-being of the refugees, I would not be harvesting through baptism or church planting. This Muslim government, this Iranian government, didn't want an American in their country. But the million Kurdish refugees overwhelmed the health care services of Iran, and their government asked other countries to send physicians and medical supplies to treat the Kurdish refugees out of their concern for their well-being. When our Baptist hospital in South Korea volunteered to send a team that included me, the response was clear that no American would be allowed to enter Iran. After weeks of negotiation, they allowed me to go in order to lead the Korean team of physicians and to offer interpretation of the Korean language to English so that local translators, local interpreters could translate from English into the local languages of Farsi and Kurdish. It wasn't lost on me that it was some sense of a moral obligation to assure that these non-citizen refugees had access to medical care that caused the Iranian government officials to allow this American citizen to enter their country. That experience reminded me of the shame that I felt for my own country regarding access to health care, and importantly, confirmed God's direction for my future to seek opportunities to use my medical skills and my use of the Korean language to serve Him in North Korea. Sharing God's love through medicine in North Korea would require a seismic shift in my life. North Korea is the most closed nation in the world. I knew Americans were not allowed to travel there. Certainly being in this communist, atheistic country as a missionary was not a possibility. Following what I perceived to be a new understanding of God's plan and purpose for my life, I resigned from the mission organization and moved my family back to Mississippi to accept an entry-level position on the faculty of the University of Mississippi School of Medicine. A key purpose in seeking that position was to obtain the credentials sufficient to offer myself as a medical education consultant to a medical school in North Korea, a pathway for gaining access to that closed country. Not many people think Mississippi is on the pathway to North Korea. Understand that all I had ever aspired to be professionally from the age of 15 until this time was a medical missionary. The one thing I was certain I did not want to pursue professionally was becoming an academic physician and researcher. God didn't seem to care. Not by my wit or skill, God provided opportunities and success in my new role as a medical educator, researcher, academic physician that allowed me the joy of sharing His love through medicine in this secular setting. And within a few years, the doors of working with the Pyongyang University School of Medicine in North Korea had opened. For more than 25 years, I traveled there intermittently and hosted groups of their faculty for training at the University of Mississippi Medical Center, all quietly, outside the glare of much public awareness. My motivation for that work in North Korea was to increase access to good health care for the people in that country. All that's written about the cruelty of that government and that country can't be exaggerated. I observed malnutrition and starvation among some of its people. I observed a scarcity of modern medicines and medical equipment. And I observed a government more focused on growing its military than in providing for its citizens. Yet, among the government representatives who facilitated my work in health care there because of true compassion for people in need, they made it possible for me, an American, to be in that place providing health care. Certainly, I worked with many in that atheistic communist country who shared my belief that access to health care was a basic human right. Over the course of a 45-year career in medicine, I'm sorely disappointed that the organizations that represent physicians in our country have not actively supported the concept of access to care for all. I'm sorely disappointed that neither our federal government and certainly not this state government have worked to assure access to health care for all. I'm sorely disappointed that over this career in medicine, I've not been able to move the needle more on this critical issue. But my largest disappointment is with church, both my denomination and church with a capital C, in our important and necessary quest to fulfill the Great Commission and make disciples. Have we neglected the importance of simply loving our neighbor, loving our enemy, and loving all in between? It is assuring that our neighbor and our enemy have access to health care, an important way of expressing love. It is a failure to work toward that access to health care for them, a failure to love them. To be sure we all understand that we're not talking about challenges of the past, know that a logger in Mississippi today faces the same issue of lack of access to health care for management of health issues. Also, many part-time workers at Walmart and many other retailers, the person who cuts your grass, the person who cleans your church, yes, the person who cleans your church, likely do not have access to affordable, basic medical care. The complexity and expense of modern health care has made access to health care a political issue. The relationship between church and politics is complicated. I don't pretend to have the answer to how the Great Commission Church should engage in solving this problem, but ignoring it is not the answer. During the Civil Rights era, historically black churches provided much of the leadership that brought necessary changes in laws and our Constitution. Historically, white evangelical churches were mostly silent or obstructive in the necessary change. Church leaders, both clerical and lay, must recognize the issue of access to health care as a moral and spiritual issue and consider action. The words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. need to be heeded. Quote, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." I cannot be silent. I will speak. I will write. I will vote. And as I seek to fulfill the Great Commission to make disciples, I will attempt to keep in front of me the great commandment to love by caring for the human and physical needs of others, just as I care about their spiritual needs. May God bless us all as we seek to understand our role in this kingdom work. Blessings. Thank you.
Dan, and thank you for your kind attention. Per our schedule, we're going to keep moving. We have one more lecture, and I want to introduce my friend who is going to introduce my new friend. Deidre Bell has spent her vocation, as I understand it, Deidre, in finance administration in hospitals. And she is passionate about this issue that brings us together this weekend. And Deidre is also the person behind all of the logistics of making this weekend work. So please give her your appreciation. Deidre will likewise lead our panel discussion after Michelle's presentation, so be sure to hang around for that.
Okay. It is my privilege to introduce Dr. Michelle Owens. She is a maternal fetal medicine doctor in Jackson, Mississippi. She completed her residency training at Johns Hopkins Hospital and her fellowship in maternal fetal medicine at the University of Mississippi Medical Center. She went on to serve at the University Medical Center as a tenured professor, interim chair, and chief of the maternal fetal medicine division, as well as serving as a program director of the maternal fetal medicine fellowship. She is now a professor of maternal fetal medicine at Ascension St. Vincent's Hospital. She is the National Assistant Secretary for the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and serves as a member of the Board of Directors. She serves on the Mississippi State Board of Medical Licensure and was a member of the Mississippi State Board of Nursing until becoming president of the Board of Medical Licensure this year. She is the clinical director for May Health and clinical chair of the Mississippi Maternal Mortality Review Committee. Her research and clinical interests are in hypertension and substance use disorders in pregnancy, maternal and infant mortality, sickle cell disease, and health disparities. She has authored numerous articles and book chapters. She is a passionate advocate for women's health and health equity, both locally and nationally. Dr. Owens was the inaugural host of Mississippi Public Broadcasting's Southern Remedy for Women, a talk show focused on health issues for women and the people that love them. She and her husband, District Attorney Jody Owens, have 3 children. Let's welcome Dr. Owens.
Deidre, thank you for that really warm introduction. I don't know how in the world I ended up here. I'm the last person of this wonderful lecture series, and I ended up following up Dan Jones. So I just would like to first say what an honor it is to speak with you today about some topics that are important to me. Healthcare, Mississippi, especially maternal health, Jesus, and justice. I feel like that's like the quadrifecta, if there was one. This is actually, I guess, an opportunity to take a little bit of the business and make it personal. Because for me, I think there's a mixture of all of those things in those 4 areas. While it's not my birthplace, Mississippi is my home. It is where I developed my roots. It's where I began my career. It is where I met the love of my life. And it's where our 3 amazing children, who hopefully you'll see in a second, our 3 amazing children were born. And it is where I discovered what I believe to be my true calling. I'm going to go back and forth between these because I don't need them to see, but I do need them to read. I wanted to be a doctor ever since I was 10 years old. And I had never seen a physician who looked like me. And a lot of times people say, if you can't see it, then you can't really be it. But I stand before you today as an exception to that rule. And it is with gratitude and through lots of grace that I actually am able to occupy this space, because I am one of the people who became something that I had never seen. And it has been absolutely an amazing and enriching experience for me. I knew I wanted to be a doctor, but I didn't realize at the time, as a matter of fact, I'm a hypertension researcher. I thought I was gonna do cardiothoracic surgery. I wanted to operate on hearts. And I found a different way to stay connected to the hearts of my patients without having to actually crack open their chest. So when I talk about really discovering my passion here in Mississippi, it wasn't just about women's health care, but it specifically speaks to health care for the underserved and for the vulnerable, the most vulnerable among us, mamas and their babies. So I'm a maternal fetal medicine doctor. Most of the time when I say that, people smile and they nod. They don't exactly know what that means. Most of you would call me a high-risk doctor. Some people call me a baby doctor. I would say that I am to the baby as a quarterback is to the football. So my pediatric friends in the room will get that. But I do care for babies while they are inside the womb. And the other part is that a lot of times when people come to me, they have a concern or they're worried about a problem or a complication. So a lot of people come through my door with trepidation, anxiety, worry, or concern. It's not always that they come skipping through the door happy to see me. So I am consistently in my job able to be amazed at how incredibly and wonderfully we are made. I am often reminded of the miracle of life and birth, the sacred nature, Vaughn, of life and birth. And I am overwhelmed, almost on a daily basis, at the goodness of God. But as I mentioned, my life is not all roses. There are definitely some thorns. And when those thorns are encountered, I'm at least comforted in knowing that His grace is sufficient. Not because I believe it, but because I see it played out every day in the way that He sees through to care for my patients and to make sure that ultimately everything ends up being all right. So I talk about my passion for vulnerable patients and healthcare for the underserved. One of the other parts of this is equity. And this is a lesson that something I tell people all the time. People are like, wow, this is really amazing stuff that you're doing and that you're working on. And I want to be very clear. I didn't come into this space with this knowledge. This was an evolutionary process. Because, see, I grew up a young black girl in the South. Birmingham, Alabama is where I was born and reared. And so much of my life was spent thinking about just this desire to be equal, just to be able to be viewed as equal. And so I think at some point I got focused so much on equality, and I didn't really learn a lot about equity. But if you'll look at this slide over my shoulders, this is one of the best ways I think that we can help to understand this concept of the difference between equality and equity, because I think as we've talked about issues in our country, a lot of times we resort back to, well, everything's equal now, we're all equal. But if you look at this, we know that environment is an important contributor to health, and Dr. Melvin spoke about that when she spoke about social determinants of health on last evening. And we know that environment is important, and then there's also an individual contribution. But if you had to choose between being fish number 1 or fish number 2, which fish would you choose to be? Would you like to be the fish in the nice blue, clean water? Or would you want to be the fish who lives in the house with a fisher and the water's not quite so clean? Seems like fish number 2 might have a harder time, even if they're sitting side by side. And imagine if you're fish number 2 and you look over at fish number 1 and you're like, well, we're the same fish. Why is fish number 1's house like that? What did fish number 1 do? And what if fish number 1 just got dropped into that bowl and could have easily have ended up being fish number 2? This is what's happening in our communities. We're not the only enlightened people. The folks that we're speaking about, they see these changes too. Not only do they see them, they live them, they experience them. And this is why I think the concept is it's not even about equality. we need to move to a space where we're talking now about equity, right? So the hard work has been done, equality. Now let's talk about equity. We're all familiar with equity. I grew up in the church. How many times did I pray? And Lord bless everybody according to their need. Who's ever heard it? Anybody raise your hand if you've heard that? Bless everyone according to their need. That's an equity prayer. That's a prayer of equity. Bless us according to our need. That means if I don't need too much, sprinkle a little over here on me anyway. But for those who have greater need, give unto them that they need. Equity prayer. Y'all didn't even know you were doing it. See there? And so the other thing, this is just another diagram. I'm an associative learner and a visual learner, so I like to kind of use illustrations a lot in my talks. And so this is, again, bringing us to an understanding of the difference between equality and equity. So here you can see that there are 3 different individuals who have varying heights. And let's just pretend that your height is not something you have any control over. You don't really have to pretend, because you don't. Because I'm telling you, if I could be about 3 more inches taller, oh yeah. I wouldn't be here, I'd probably be at Fashion Week in Paris or something. Preferably on a runway wearing some really killer clothes. But so varying situations here that they don't have any control over. One person's taller, one person's smaller. And equality is just giving them all the same thing. Here you go. Well, I would submit to you that while this little person's a little bit further off the ground than they would be if they were not on the box, I don't know that that box is really making a substantial difference in their circumstance or situation. But we've given them a box. I mean, you got some assistance. You should be happy. Because otherwise, look where you'd be. You'd just be on the ground. But ultimately, what's the impact? So then we look at equity. Again, Lord, bless us according to our need. I can see over the fence, so I don't really need a box. Okay. Now at least we all have the ability to see. Now one person needs 1 box, some person needs 2 boxes. This person actually is still looking and still experiencing the game. They are not looking over here a little angry because they don't have a box. Hey, I don't have a box. But then if we look at that extra step, moving beyond equity into the space of justice, well, that's when the whole barrier is removed from everyone. And so hopefully in the course of the time that we are talking today, the last lecture of your evening, hopefully we'll be able to move from this concept or think a little bit about how we go from just us to justice. Yes, I quote myself in slides. You should not have to choose between living and your health. You should be able to live healthy. The truth is that for many among us, not just in Mississippi, but all over this country, people have to make choices every day between whether or not they're going to live or if they're going to be healthy. Sometimes those choices, as we've heard, are financial in nature. I have patients who don't buy insulin, even if it's over-the-counter insulin, which is cheaper, because they have to use that money instead to feed their families. And in the medical record, it would read as though they are not compliant. But it's not that they're not compliant, it's just that their priorities are aligned differently. And they've not chosen to prioritize their health because there are other things of higher priority that they consider to be necessities that they must choose. Many of us don't know what it feels like to have to make those choices. And that is a wonderful thing, and we should be grateful. But in our gratitude, we can't forget that our experience is very different from, as we've heard, the lion's share of people in this country and even in our state. So I'm just going to take a moment to share with you a little bit about what I do and the state of maternal health in Mississippi. And we're going to include some information on infant health as well. Some of you may be familiar with this data, and others of you may not have heard it. But I would like for you to at least understand a little bit about the scope of the problem. I originally, when I was asked to do this, said, I came up with this title, Our Sisters Keepers. And I said, meeting the challenges of maternal health in Mississippi. I guess it should have been understanding the challenges, because I'm probably going to tell you more about the challenges and kind of challenge you to think about how we can meet these challenges. And one of the things that came to my mind as I was thinking about this was this concept of our sister's keeper. And so I thought of a bunch of scriptures. And the first one that I thought of was Genesis 4, 9 and 10, not just 4:9. A lot of people get the 4:9, but I use 4:9 and 10. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel, thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? Kind of sounds like a little smarty kid, doesn't it? Like, I don't know. In his skin, I don't know. And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. I grew up in church. Most people stop at 4:9. They don't throw in that 10. But think about that. That those who have experienced wrongdoing, those who are marginalized, who are left behind, those who are hurting, their voices, their hearts are crying out to God. They might be crying out in front of us. And even if we don't hear them, knowing that God hears them, you can imagine Abel is dead. And God is saying, his blood is crying out to me from the ground. What have you done? And I think that's really powerful because it just shows he hears us. He knows us. These are things that we talk about in church all the time. But I don't know that we always apply them in the same way. We sometimes will apply them in ways of convenience, right? Crying out to me from the ground. So this is Mississippi at a glance. I'm going to share some data with you. It is pretty consistent with some of the things that we've heard before. Right now, our preterm birth rate, which is babies who are born too soon, about 1 in 7 or 15%. Preterm being born before 37 completed weeks of pregnancy. 1 in 8 or 12.3% are low birth weight. And I think this is pretty illustrative. The smallest and the earliest are the babies who require the most and who actually have the greatest morbidity and mortality. So that might help to color in some of the information that you've heard a little bit about our infant mortality rate. 9.39 per thousand, which is our infant mortality rate, which is among the highest in the nation, as I'm sure you may have heard. And in this area, there's also disparities that exist. So it's 9.3 per thousand overall. But when you look at the disparities in racial groups between blacks and whites, the rate in the black community is almost double that in the white community. I think it's like 5.6 versus almost 11 per thousand. And these are babies who do not make it to their first birthday. The first birthday is a big shindig. It's really more for the parents, but it's still a big deal. And if you can imagine, we're talking about hundreds of babies that are born. We have anywhere in Mississippi over the past 10 years, our numbers have gone anywhere from 35 to 45,000 births per year. And roughly 10 per thousand is our rate. Our cesarean section rate is about 38.5% compared to the national average of 32.1%. And roughly 18%, 17.2% of women of childbearing age are uninsured. Everybody gets Medicaid, not everybody. And then let's talk a little bit about the contribution of Medicaid. So Medicaid covers in this country roughly about 42% of all births. But in Mississippi and some of our sister states within the Deep South, that number is significantly higher. In Mississippi, it's upward of 60%. And it's anywhere from year to year, can fluctuate anywhere from 60 to 65% of births that are covered by Medicaid. And this is why it's been so important for us to talk about Medicaid expansion, or Medicaid, well, not Medicaid expansion, but Medicaid extension, postpartum Medicaid. And why there was so much conversation, and we talked about this issue for years down at the Capitol, trying to get this initiative passed. Finally, we did get this measure passed last year, which was a phenomenal win for our moms. But 60% of all the births, that's 25,000 or so, based on the numbers that we have for deliveries. And so this is really about what I call birthing in the desert. There's also another term that we use, which is maternity care deserts. And over 50% of the counties within our state have none, no access to OBGYN services at all. So that means, and that's not just birthing, but it's birthing. It's your pap smears, because we got some cancer people who are here. It's your mammograms. It's the person who's going to follow those things up and make sure that you're getting the care that you need. The preventive care for my public health people, and also your problem-based care. 50% of the counties within our state don't have a person who can provide that service. And as we're talking about changes in Medicare and Medicaid and funding, we've also seen that those hospitals that might offer birthing facilities, especially in places like the Mississippi Delta, are in a very critical place where their future is uncertain. And so those numbers, at this point, could potentially be worse. And I apologize if this doesn't show very well, but for those of you who are out here, look for your county and see what color you are. But red does not mean you're awesome. Red means you're in the desert, just so you know. And what's the predominant color here? And for those people who have red-green color blindness, I apologize. I probably need to change the colors on the slide. But just take my word for it. Most of the dark stuff is red. And this just kind of goes to what I mentioned before as we're talking about the importance. So we talk about Medicaid, and people want Medicaid just to be about taking care of poor people who may or may not, based on our determinations, deserve it. But this is one of the unintended consequences, because there's money that comes through CMS that helps to support hospitals. Now, you've heard about the state of our health. So we're not exactly bastions of great health within the state, but there are institutions that are out there that are trying to meet the need. And look at the financial issues. Rural hospitals at risk of closing. Purple. We got about 31. If you look at rural hospitals at immediate risk, 22 in Mississippi, and this data is of July of 2023. It's updated every 3 months. I looked, and the one for this month or next month has not yet been released. So this is where we are. And so when people are talking about these critical access hospitals and hospitals that are failing and hospitals that are closing, this is not something that people are making up, and it is right in our backyard, and we already are in a situation where there aren't a lot of those resources available. So I want you to understand the sense of urgency. Because when these places do close, or if they have to close their doors, if they're no longer able to service the population that we're already struggling to meet the needs of, what's going to happen? A lot of this we've kind of already reviewed, but I want to specifically speak to the rural component because it's important. Just under 35% of our babies are born to women who live in rural counties. I just showed you what's happening in our rural hospitals. About a quarter of those women have no birthing hospital within 30 minutes. within 30 minutes. And those are the ones that are open. And people would say, well, it doesn't matter because they're in these rural areas, so it's not a lot. Just almost 1 in 4 of all births actually occurred in these maternity care deserts. So this is a legitimate population. And even though they may not be the highest volumes, they still represent a considerable amount of births, and these women need care. When you look at our providers, we talk about provider shortages. Where are they? 1/4 of them practice in rural communities. There's an incredible need for doctors in rural communities. But the ones who are there, they are churning them as fast as they can. This is just another schematic. I changed it to blue, yay. That talks about the distance to birthing hospitals by county. And we can see here on average, women in Mississippi will travel just about 20 miles to the nearest hospital. And this just kind of shows when you're in a maternity care desert versus those people who have limited access versus those who have full access. I apologize to my people on the right. I always tend to look and point over my left shoulder. But you can see the average miles that people have to travel for maternity care. And this is just to show about Medicaid expansion, since that has also been discussed, and is definitely, I think, an important component of a potential solution to some of these issues, especially as it pertains to how we pump life's blood back into some of these hospitals that are really struggling. And the next slide is going to be related to our preterm birth rate. So that's a spoiler alert, because I'm going to flip back and forth between these really quickly. But I want you to see this. So this is state action on Medicaid expansion. See who the adopters are, who the ones that are not, and then the blues, the light blues, are those that are where it's adopted but not implemented, right? So you can see here where the yellow areas are. This is the preterm birth rate and grades by state. Again, red does not mean you're awesome. Red is the equivalent of F. The overall grade in the country is a whopping D. However, check this out. Just look right here. And I'm going to flip back for you. We'll do that one more time. Some people would say those two things are unrelated. It's possible. It's possible. Look, I'm not the epidemiologist in the room. We can call Dr. Melvin up here and let her talk about that. But just for information purposes, it's just interesting, the distribution, right? And this is, so the first 9 weeks have already passed, and my children have brought home report cards. We're in the second 9 weeks. This is the 2022 report from the March of Dimes for the state of Mississippi for our prematurity birth rate. There's a lot of work to do. We don't have a lot of people to do it. And the folks who are doing it are working as hard as they can, and yet and still, we are not meeting the needs. And the people who are suffering are our brothers and our sisters. This just speaks to the disparities that exist, and I throw this out because sometimes our information may even look, even if it's bad, it may be even more optimistic than the realities for certain groups within our collective data. So I just wanted to show you the health disparities that exist when we're looking at premature birth rates within our state. So I told you our number is 15% overall. But when you look at the preterm birth rate among Black women, it's 43% higher than our white counterparts, than all other groups. And another thing that I'd like to elevate as well, we don't speak a lot about it, but our Native American brothers and sisters also experience a lot of negative outcomes, adverse outcomes. And a lot of times, because of the unique circumstances of how they may live, whether it's, on reservations, et cetera, their voices a lot of times are not included in this discussion, and they are very much affected. And so I'd like for us I know it's hard in the South, we are really black and white, but we really aren't. And we need to consider everyone. They are Medicaid recipients. As a matter of fact, among the highest percentages of Medicaid recipients in our Native American population across the country. And so we also need to remember them as well, even though they may not always be sitting among us. So now we're going to talk a little bit about opportunities. Maternal mortality, which is kind of my jam, if you will. A little song came on the radio, and my daughter goes, "That's my jam." What? So this is the area that I've been doing a lot of work in over the past few years, and is really kind of evolving. And we are really trying to jump in and do the hard work of moving us in the right direction here. You've heard this, I think. Dr. Melvin kind of gave you all a snapshot of this, so I'll just move very quickly. The non-Hispanic African-American rate for maternal mortality overall, when you look at our ratios, is about 4 times that of white women. When we look at the timing of our deaths, 57.5% occurred within the first 60 days after birth, but a significant number, almost 43%, occurred after 60 days, which was kind of the push behind us being able to move the needle and to extend postpartum Medicaid coverage for moms in order to kind of help capture some of those people and decrease the amount of morbidity and mortality that occurs within that first year. So I really would like to get mamas and babies all to make it to the first birthday. I think it's a win when the mama's at the birthday party and the baby's at the birthday party. If one of them's not there, then I feel like we've missed the mark. And I believe that that is real and it's achievable here in this state. We can do this. When we look at the maternal deaths and what is the leading cause of maternal deaths, and you break that out by race, we find that the contributing factors are a little different. So cardiovascular conditions and cardiomyopathy tend to contribute more to maternal deaths in our Black population. When we look at white non-Hispanics, it is distributed a little bit more evenly. Cardiovascular problems, blood clots, and then cerebrovascular accidents or strokes. And that's just another schematic that shows the same. And this is kind of just showing Mississippi in dark purple and our national percentages in light purple. So you can see how Mississippi outpaces the country in certain areas, and then kind of the areas where nationally we are kind of behind the curve. So fortunately, hemorrhage, infection, hypertensive disorders. And the interesting thing that I love about this is that this is a result slide. Because here in Mississippi, we have bundles, safety bundles that have been implemented in hospitals across our state that specifically speak to hemorrhage, that specifically speak to hypertension. And we can tell that if we really do the work, that we can actually make a difference. But still, over 80% of our deaths are preventable. 80%. That means that 2 times out of 10, there wasn't really much that could be done. And when you look at the national data, it's exactly the same. And I always stratify these things out. I love talking about things other than race, but I think that it's important because, again, we'll take a number and we'll run with it, and we won't realize how the disparities actually play out. And it's really important. Non-Hispanic Black group, again, highest every single year. And a good friend of mine who happened to have been speaking at this symposium said to me, I often ask the question, well, what's wrong with what's wrong with black mothers? Is it something wrong with black mothers? Well, let's see. So, look, I'm telling you, I've been an athlete and I'm retired. I've been retired for a long time. But I don't know if my abs ever were that good. But 3 of the 4 of those women, now this was the Women's Olympic 400-meter relay team. The 2016 champions. 3 out of 4 of those women either died or almost died during childbirth. So maybe it's not that we're just all out of shape and deconditioned down here in Mississippi, because clearly these women were not. Well, Michelle, you know, down there, y'all got some education issues. And so maybe it's just that they're not educated. They just, you know, they don't have good health care access. So this is Shalon Irving, Dr. Shalon Irving, who worked for the CDC and who worked on maternal mortality. And this is Shanice Wallace, who was born in Alabama, but was a resident in Indianapolis, both of whom died. One postpartum, Shalon died postpartum, and Dr. Wallace died immediately following childbirth. So I would submit to you that it's not education, because Dr. Irving has a PhD, and Dr. Wallace was an MD who was in the hospital where she worked when she died. So I don't know that that's the answer either. We also are seeing a surge in mental health and the contributions of mental health overall to maternal mortality. And this is really concerning, because this and substance use disorders are now starting to rear their ugly heads, and we're starting to see increases in those as contributors to overall maternal mortality. And a lot of these are late deaths. So we have the opportunity for intervention, and I'm hoping that as we start talking about policy changes and things that we can do, that we will have the necessary interventions to provide good mental health services and to make sure that people have ready access. And I just want to, this corner part of the slide is the main part of the slide to me. Up to 50% of women living in poverty will suffer from a maternal mental health disorder. We screen every person. Every pregnant person we screen for gestational diabetes, postpartum depression, pregnancy mental health disorders, far more common than gestational diabetes or hypertension. And we have people who won't screen them because they don't know what to do with the information. These are just some of the benefits of postpartum Medicaid extension. Wanted you guys to be aware as we are doing this, what we've seen demonstrated in the literature to be benefits from the places that had done this before us. So this is some of the good news, some of the things that we can look forward to when we're thinking about what is going to happen for us. And my good friend, Dr. Joya Crear-Perry, who is really great for one-liners, made the statement, what would it look like for mothers not only to survive pregnancy, but to thrive? Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we are at a space where we are actually talking about whether or not they are going to survive. Living is the bar. Living while birthing is the bar. How's that for situational irony? Living while birthing in 2023 is our bar. One of the other things that Joya says that I think is really great, that speaks to some of the questions when we talk about disparities that exist, is Joya says that it is racism and not race that contributes to and causes health disparities. So it's not that there's something wrong with our black and brown brothers and sisters, but that the systems that exist, that they live in every day, poverty, if it's all of these other systemic issues weathering, those things contribute to their overall health and the condition that we meet them in when they interface with us in healthcare. Because you know what? I send my patients back into their environments. And we know about stress and what that does. We know what it's like to be, how difficult is it for a mom who is sitting at the table trying to figure out how to make ends meet. And if you've got to choose which of your utilities is going to be on and which one's going to be off. We can't separate our physical health from our emotional well-being. They are inextricably tied together. And to think for a moment that the environments in which Fish 1 and Fish 2, the environments in which they exist don't impact how they have health outcomes, I think is really short-sighted. Another quote from me. Pregnancy should not be a death sentence. I think about what does it mean to be like Christ? And I think that, let's just think about it. Well, what did he do when he saw someone in need, when he saw someone hurting, when he encountered the sick, the questioning, the skeptical, even those people who didn't agree with him, the folks who challenged? He wasn't ambivalent, he wasn't indifferent. What do we know about the people that he healed? Do we know if those people had pleasant dispositions? Do we know if they were mean or kind, if they were super educated, or if they were people who never had any education at all? I got a theory I share with my dad. I said, Dad, everything that's in the Bible that's essential or important, God has made it very explicitly clear. And the stuff that he doesn't fill in is because it's not important. It's not important. You can interpret it however you want. It doesn't matter, because the most important things he's laid it out for us because he knows the limitations that we have. He didn't tell us about those things, I believe, because it really didn't matter, because it didn't matter to Jesus. What he wanted us to see was that you could have an infirmity, and whatever that was, there was love, respect, and empathy. Love, respect, and empathy. And then he shall answer them, saying, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you did it for the least of these, you have done it to me. There is so much fear that we assign otherness to people because we are afraid of things that are different. And one of my good friends said, Michelle, I believe that God made us different so that we could learn more, because we're not going to learn about the things that are comfortable, that we know. But what happens when you see somebody? Let somebody walk in and they got on the wrong kind of outfit. What do? First of all, you can't take your eyes off of them. And if there's somebody that you trust sitting next to you, you're going to be like, do you see this? And don't we do that? With anything that looks unusual or different, we're captivated by it. There is an inquiry that comes with that, a curiosity. What if that is the mechanism that is in each of us that would enable us, since we can't know it all, to know more about each other, to lean into that with wonder, as you've heard? What if that is the way that we learn to help bear one another's burdens? Inasmuch as you did it for the least of these, you've done it to me. I'm going to leave you with a quote from Martin Luther King that says, of all the forms of discrimination and inequalities, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhuman. There's no fear in love. True love casts out fear. We can't be afraid. We shouldn't be afraid. He's commanded us to love, which means that we can move fearlessly forward. Thank you so much for your time.
On your tables, I want to remind you of the cards. If you have questions that you would like to see addressed in our panel, and that's coming up. We're going to take about a 10-minute break and come back, and we will have our panel, and that will conclude us. Aren't you glad you stuck around? Our speakers have gifted us beyond our highest hopes, and I am so grateful. We will take about a 10-minute break now, and we will set up the tables here for the panels and then come back and take your seats, and Deidre will lead us in that panel discussion. Thank you.
Testing 1, 2. We're testing microphone number 4. Luke, I am your father. And to be a carpenter slash counselor, you're really good at this. Ooh, you got that mic tight. It should work though. Okay, 5. We got number 5. Testing 1, 2, 3. All right. Stay tuned for more. Okay. All right, here we are on 6. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Lots of good sound. Because of our streaming audience, they really need to be on the mic if they're going to be saying stuff for our guests, our panelists.
If you have a question on a card and we have not gotten it from you, raise your hand and I will come get it. If you have a question on a card, just simply raise your hand and we will come and get it.
Good job, although we probably could have left them a little more slack out the front.
I'm going to say that one more time as people are coming in. If you have a question you're writing and you want us to ask it, just raise your hand where you are and Deidre will come get it. All right, thank you.
If you will return to your tables, and if our speakers will come and find a place at the tables on the platform.
Yeah. Yeah, that should be good. I am. Good afternoon, and thank y'all for being here. I'm going to take moderator's privilege. I have a question, and I want to frame it because I think there's an aspect of healthcare access that we haven't paid enough attention to today, and that is mental health. It's a topic that I've had some experience with in my family and professionally, and I was reminded of it this week while I was reading Adam Hamilton's book on Luke's writing about Jesus' time with the outsiders, outlaws, and outcasts. He told several stories of Jesus healing lepers, and one in particular, Luke 5:12-13, the leper said to him, "Lord, you can heal me if you want to." And not an exact quote. And Jesus reached out and touched him and says, "I want to be healed." And, lepers, I think, when I read it, makes me think of really just the outcasts, those people who were unclean, that nobody wanted to be around, nobody wanted to touch. And, today our lepers are the mentally ill. They are in our prisons, they are on the streets. They are the people that we don't want to touch, that we consider unclean. It's a fact. Now, we embrace our families. I agree. I embrace mine. But in general, society and healthcare has done that. Insurance companies deliberately use strategies to reduce the access to mental health care because they considered it a waste of money. Mm-hmm. And when we started deinstitutionalizing people back in the 60s, it was because we said they had the ability to make that personal choice. And I don't disagree with that, but that mentality then has been used as a way to say, well, the person that's mentally ill has made a choice. And that is not true. And it has a huge impact on our children. Looking at the CDC, 10 leading causes of death, and this isn't broken out by sex or race, but I do have the ages. And if you look at ages 10 to 14, the second most common cause of death is suicide. 15 to 24, the second most common cause of death is homicide, and the third is suicide. You look at 25 to 34, and it is number 2 is suicide, number 4 is homicide. mental health is a crisis that's killing our children. And included in that, along with that, is addiction and the impact of our addiction crisis. Overdoses among children increased from 2000 to 2021 by 186%, and between 2019 and 21, 103%. So how do we make sure that access to mental health care, which is restricted not because of access to Medicaid, but to many, many others because we don't have resources in the community, and our insurance plans, those that are insured, also have restrictions placed on it that hinder the ability to treat these diseases. So anybody that would like to respond.
I do want to say something. I'm going to leave it for the physicians to really talk about the actual issue of mental health, but I think one of the issues too is our society has changed. I think when we look at suicide rates, we also see that kids are more on social media more. Mm-hmm. People have more access to them. There's more bullying that when it used to just happen maybe at school, now it can happen all the time because they're focused on this social media. So I think when they're so young, their brains are still developing, their self-esteem is still developing, they're trying to be like everyone else. I think before we can actually treat, we also need to look at what the factors are that even put that child at risk or that young adult at risk. And I think this whole technology and social media world that we live in is one of the contributing factors. We talked about the church. One of the reasons that people commit suicide is the stigma attached to getting help. Mm-hmm. If they try to get help, then what does that do for their job? Is their job still going to be safe? What does that do for them to be able to access care? Because now they've been diagnosed with a condition. So one of the things that I think we need to do is really work on the stigma that's been attached to mental health so that we can encourage people who know that they need it to reach it, to receive it without any repercussions for seeking the care. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Melvin. So one of the things that I've always found interesting about mental health challenges, when I was in college, I heard a professor say that one of the devil's most effective tools for destroying human life is isolation. Dr. Melvin talked at length last night about the importance of community, and I think mental health needs get met most effectively in community, starting with family. Because it is not like, mental health issues aren't like checking blood pressure. I can check my own blood pressure, and I can know I need to go see Dr. Turner. Mental health issues are often kind of reflected in the backdrop, the context, the environment, the people you're around can say, hey, you've been acting a little different lately. So when care is accessible, you still need that support system. So I think that one of the most important things we can do as individuals, certainly as people of faith, is create a more affirming culture for people to be vulnerable. We have to pay better attention to each other. I have teenage daughters, and they're probably so sick of me asking, how you doing? What's going on? They're always thinking about the question behind the question. And I tell them, not only do your mom and I want to be a resource for you, we also want you to know that we're a safe place for your friends, because that is the way we want to model community. And the last thing I'll share about that, because I think it may be of great benefit to the audience, I was fascinated a few years ago by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, her book, The Deepest Well, which talked about adverse childhood experiences. A lot of the mental health issues even other health issues we see today are the result of the cumulative impact of adverse childhood experiences. Poverty is one, physical and mental, sexual abuse, those are all on the list. And the higher our ACE score, the more difficult our lives will likely be. And pressure will always burst a pipe. And that bursted pipe sometimes is the manifested mental health issue. So I think community is the first solution, and then we can prioritize the policy. We can drive the policy, but the culture must shift first.
I agree.
I'll say that one of the issues that I think is a problem is specifically when we talk about access, is about affordability even. Because there are some mental health services that are available, but they are cost prohibitive. I did my training in Baltimore, Maryland, and worked at the Center for Addiction and Pregnancy. And one of the reasons that that program was successful, and this is almost 20 years ago, in inner city Baltimore, was because there was an inpatient component, and it was an inpatient process that they did not have to pay for out of pocket. It was available to be utilized without a hefty price tag. And so we were able to, at least for people who were struggling with substance use disorders, bring them into an inpatient treatment facility where they did not have to pony up thousands of dollars for care. We were able to create and foster a more positive environment for them, because a lot of times with substance use disorder, if you are actually going to move into a space of recovery, then you need to change your entire environment, right? People say, "I just quit." Well, they are quitting everything, because that means new friends, new everything, and a lot of times they don't have support because they have alienated themselves through their substance use disorder. Families get tired. It's the last straw. You can't be trusted. You stole my TV, or $50 is disappearing out of mama's wallet, those kinds of things. And so I think that the cost prohibitive nature, and we talk about access in a variety of levels, it's not just how close you are, proximity to, but it is your ability to actually participate in, right? And so geography is one thing, and then there's the cost component. And because we have a shortage of providers in mental health spaces, they kind of get to call the shots. And so there is an issue where, because there are fewer of them, it can be more difficult to access or to be able to find somebody who you can be seen by. And then the other issue, I think, is cost. And we don't talk a lot about that being expensive, but seeing a psychologist, behavioral therapist, and those kinds of things can be very expensive. And a lot it's almost like finding a dermatologist. They won't take insurance or what have you, or if they do, they don't take certain types. So while Medicaid is not an answer, there are, at least in our space, in the pregnancy space, there are groups like Mommy who provide mental health support and services for birthing people who take Medicaid. And so I think having at least some options that do either make provisions for something that is more cost effective is an important part of filling that gap.
Okay, I will start reading. We have a stack of questions. You have a very engaged audience.
Who's got the timer?
and I will do my best. The first one: why are statistics presented within a black-white context? This binary approach does not include other groupings such as Native American, Hispanic, Latino, Asians, etc. Yes.
As an epidemiologist, I will tell you that here in Mississippi, when the data is often analyzed, it's analyzed that way. So if you don't have the raw data, you can't break it down because often the numbers are so small that they decide not to project those numbers. So here, because it's majority black and white, our numbers are usually presented that way. And if you go onto the Department of Health's website, usually it's presented that way.
This one's really straightforward. How can we get Medicaid expansion passed in Mississippi? I think that's just a vote of confidence there. While I personally agree with the statements that healthcare access is a moral imperative, I'm curious if our panel thinks that fact will carry much weight substance with the Mississippi legislature. Would we possibly be any better able to change minds if we better publicize the economic benefits of Medicaid expansion? We are learning that there's dollars on the table and costing our hospital more and more money, but not facilitating preventative care. So it's the question, I think the question is pretty straightforward. Are we communicating the right message?
I would like to address that. There's been plenty of studies on the economic benefits of expanding Medicaid. Right now, if we did it, we're talking about $1.6 billion. If we did it right now, it would come in next year. 1.6 for the next 3 years and about $1 billion every year after that. We've turned down, at this point, over $10 billion by not expanding Medicaid. So the economic argument's out there. I mean, that's just all there is to it. And there's plenty of people tooting that horn. What's amazing to me, in a state that is saturated with religiosity, there's not more of a moral call from the Christian and religious communities to do the right thing. And I said this before, and I'll just say it again to echo it. If you are a white religious leader in the state of Mississippi and you ever wondered what you would have done during the civil rights movement, you don't ever have to wonder again. You're doing it right now. This is what you would have done in the 1960s. So I think it's absolutely one of those issues, because I think the issue does, so much of the root of what we're talking about has to do with white superiority and racism. And so neglecting the health of folks who need it most is not, that's not a new thing in the state of Mississippi. But it is a new thing for for pastors to say so for whatever reason.
May I respond to that? Because I think and actually, Dr. Owens, did you want to respond to the previous question? Because you reached, and I'm about to address it too. So I want to just acknowledge race is very difficult to talk about. It's very uncomfortable to talk about. It is like hard medicine. It's like nasty medicine. Castor oil. Yeah, or that's asphytida, that stuff my grandmother used to have in a jar, my great-grandmother. And so I'm here for that conversation. There is the story that's told of two fish. Several people have told it in books and other spaces. Two fish swimming in one direction, one fish swimming in the other. The single fish meets the other two and he asks them, "How's the water?" And they look and they keep going. A little bit down the ways, one of the fish looks at the other and he says, "What is water?" Well, chances are that single fish had an experience, probably a bad one with a hook. He'd had the experience of being out of water. He was exposed. He had a new point of reference. Very intentionally, we've been socialized in Mississippi to stay segregated, or we have been segregated for very intentional reasons. And one of the costs of that is that we don't always know the intimate experiences of people of different races. When you look, as Dr. Melvin pointed out, Dr. Owens pointed out, Jason pointed out, when you look at the data, yeah, we're 50th or 49th, but it's not an equal experience for Mississippians. In many instances, the negative statistic doubles for the state's black population. And what we know about the stratification of race across the globe is you will find at the bottom of every strata, black women, and you will find able-bodied white males at the top. That is not coincidental. So it's important that we look at the data through that lens because it tells us where we can focus the most light. And if we have been taught to believe, as I talked about earlier, that people are there because either they deserve to be there, or there's a cultural rot that puts them there, or they're just not worth as much as we are. So them being there is not that problematic. Those are all things that have to be interrogated. And we have to do it as Mississippians, and we can't do it if we're afraid to confront the data and what the story it tells us.
I would like to just kind of piggyback on that really quickly because I think I've had the benefit of sharing with close, trusted friends who were not of the same race, and as we have endeavored to learn more about each other, and also as we have been disappointed in what we viewed as a lack of progress. It's almost like when you start talking about issues of race, or if you say the term racism, that we almost stonewall each other. Let me be very clear. It is not comfortable, I don't think, for any of us to talk about many of these issues, but I think, especially for those of us who live in the Deep South, to not recognize how significant of a role this has played in part of the legacy that we have inherited. And it's through no fault of our own. It's actually part of our birthright. You just kind of, congratulations, you get to inherit this. You're born into it, right? We're all born into it. And just as I've heard people say things like, well, I didn't own any slaves. And I'm like, well, I've never been one. But I also still recognize that there is a portion of that legacy that has filtered down and is manifested in very different ways than it might have been at that time, and in some ways probably not as different as it was at that time, just changing form. But those conversations, for as uncomfortable as it may be, and I will say this as a person who has experienced privilege too in different spaces, when you are in the privileged group, sometimes you can feel attacked. And sometimes it's really hard because the conversations and the experiences that you hear may sometimes even hurt you to know that people have experienced life that way, and that if it were left up to you, you would never make that choice. But unfortunately, that is the reality that exists for many people. And I think if we move away from blame and just recognize that that is kind of a part of where we are right now, and we can't really ignore it, because if we ignore it, then we're really ignoring each other's experiences, and be willing to. I'm working in the DEIE space with my national organization, and we said we were just going to start making buttons that say, come be uncomfortable with us. Because for as uncomfortable it is to have the conversation, I would just submit to you that for many people, it is equally as uncomfortable for them to live. And it's equally as uncomfortable for them to experience. None of us likes to be pointed out as being wrong, and this came up at our lunch discussion. There are plenty of good, comfortable seats at the table of accusation, but the table of accountabilities seats feel very different.
And if we all recognize that there's a part that we have to play in the healing, you might not have caused the injury. I get to fix things regularly that I didn't have anything to do with making. But we can still fix it. We don't have to pretend it doesn't exist. We don't have to negate it. And we can let it be as horrible as it was, and we can say that was, but that doesn't have to be what is. And I think the thing that can be very dehumanizing is when people who you believe in, when you want to believe something better is possible, would shy away from just the mere conversation.
What is there in the position of those opposed to Medicaid expansion that has merit and/or needs to be considered more carefully by those of us who are for Medicaid expansion or extension? Are there things that the detractors from Medicaid expansion that we should be considering?
No.
That's what I was looking for.
Let me say this. I think in community, we have to always honor people's fear.
Yes.
I was describing to my children recently how greed, in my mind, is driven by fear. The greed is driven by fear of scarcity. So when I interact with someone I perceive as greedy, I will ask myself, like our guideposts say, turn to wonder. I wonder what experience with lack they had early in life that makes them deathly afraid of running out. That's what I think we have to honor. But they have to explain it. They owe it to the community to explain it. And then we will walk with them. Right? Because we know what the moral imperative is. We know what the calling is. Come walk with us. Like, we got you. Relax on the fear.
Okay.
As Jason has pointed out, I do think this is an issue of white supremacy, but there's conscious bias and unconscious bias. For most of my friends, who I think who will fall in that what I call the 70-45 gap. So if you look at recent polling in Mississippi, about 70% of people favor expansion of Medicaid. If you ask the question, do you favor expansion of Medicaid? And about 45% in polls say that they will vote for a candidate who has made it part of his platform to expand Medicaid. And so there's a 25% gap there. And most of my friends that I talk to who I think will vote in a way that won't allow Medicaid to be expanded, we'll talk about the economy. They'll talk about who has the strongest business plan and so forth. They won't say it's because I don't want black people to have access to health care. But unconsciously, I think that is a major issue, in not just in Mississippi, but in our country.
Okay, this card has 3 or 4 different questions. I'm just going to go ahead and read them all so that you can know that this is what the person was going to bring forward. First is, what is the difference in white supremacy and white superiority? Is the root cause of health inequities racism or poverty? Medicaid expansion is critically important, but what about the uninsured? What about those that have Medicaid but find barriers in their path? And I think those are all related in some ways when you think about it.
My word count is high, so I'm going to defer to somebody else.
I'll speak a little bit to that. I do think white superiority and white supremacy are synonymous, I think, in most cases. The reason I'm pulling this mic up is because I think white people need to talk about it among themselves. We created it. It is our problem that we created to systematically oppress an entire part of humanity.
and we've benefited from it. If you look at the global population, only about 8% of the global population is white. And you think about global ramifications of white superiority and white supremacy. So I think they are synonymous terms. I think the white community needs to dig deep and start having conversations with each other instead of looking towards the black community and say, can you help us understand this? As if we are the victim of something that we created for ourselves. So I think that's, the black community has done an incredible amount of work for a very long time. Just about at every part of their history from being in North America. But you try to look at the same time period, how many white people have stood up to try to give an account and answer. And one, I grew up poor, and we had a deacon of a Baptist church in town come in and kind of just push our door in, and it was around Thanksgiving, put 2 bags of groceries on our kitchen table. And he looked at my mother and he said, well, Mary, the deacons decided to help some poor people in town, so, this is to help out for Thanksgiving, right? And my mother absolutely melted, and I hated that man for that. I wanted to throw the canned vegetables at his truck. But you know what? They came to our house with those groceries. And they didn't go to, there wasn't a black family in Shaw, Mississippi that they took those groceries to. So even as poor white, we had groceries, as despicable as it was. My mom's dignity is worth more than 2 bags of groceries, but we had those groceries. And there were other families that did not, never had, never will kind of space. So even, it doesn't matter the economics of the space in the white side, we have work to do with each other, and it's high time that we start doing it. Poverty and race are always intersectional in U.S. You look at the history of the creation of race in the Americas in the 1600s, Bacon Revolt, and how politicians at the time in Virginia created laws to favor poor white people over their black counterparts, and it was the creation of racism as the same time as the creation of race. So there's a lot of history there, and it was dividing poor people so that the rich could continue to have what they have. That's history. We can do some reading on it. So.
And I'll just say that racism is definitely a determinant of health. The American Public Health Association acknowledged it. The American Medical Association has acknowledged it. Those of us who live in the United States know that there is a difference in how people are treated based on their race. But one of the most insidious things that has begun to happen is, as we talk about things like equality, like Dr. Owen said, there are now being measures put in place to systemically inject racism into policy. So when we look at things like redlining, what is the one thing that is equated with wealth? It's owning a home. But when I start redlining so that people cannot buy homes in certain neighborhoods, we're intentionally putting them in a space where they cannot generate wealth over a long period of time. When we start talking about voting and choosing people that vote in your best interest, and then you redistrict the whole map so that even if I vote, my vote doesn't count because I've designed the map in such a way, in some ways that are so ridiculous that you're wondering, do these people even live next to each other? District 2 is over here, and then it's over in North Mississippi somewhere far away from the other part of District 2. So when you think about how we intentionally set up policies to keep certain people from accessing, which is the equity part of it. We can say we're doing things equally, but then when we come back and then we redraw the map, we've made it so that the vote doesn't count, even though we live right next to our neighbor. So at that point, we have to look at the policies. So racism has changed the way it looks now. It's not just covert. It's not just you can't drink out of this water fountain, or you can't go into this bathroom. It's more you can use those bathrooms, you can still vote, but now we're just going to use the law to create the policies that we want in place to make sure that you aren't successful. And that's really what Medicaid expansion is about too. It's about creating a narrative that if we give people insurance, it's going to be a bunch of welfare people that are going to access Medicaid. And the reality is it's not, Medicaid is not just for poor people. It's for disabled people. I mean, a lot of people use Medicaid. So when you think about the narrative of what we've been told Medicaid is for, the idea is always it's somebody who doesn't want to work, they're lazy, they just want to live off of the government. And we know that's not true, and we know better. And the reason I know that we know better is what happened in 2020 when we opened up all these programs to help people, because regardless of color, race, they didn't have access to certain things because of COVID. Remember? All those programs, did it just help black people? No. It helped everybody because everyone was on the same equal playing field. And we knew what we had to do for people and families to survive. And so we opened it up so that the government helped people. And nobody stepped up and complained about it when it was happening because everyone was taking advantage of it. So because we knew that was the route to go then when we were in the middle of a pandemic, we're still in the middle of an epidemic. It's an epidemic of poverty. It's an epidemic of people. The other thing we found out during COVID was how many kids only got that one meal a day, and that's the food that they received at school. When they could no longer go to school and get the food, what did we do? We opened up the schools just so that they could have access to it, right? It didn't matter about your socioeconomic status or your race. So I know we know better because when it affects everyone, we do better, right? It's only when one part of society is being affected. And when I talk about these things, it's not just about race. It's also about things like sexual orientation. It's about what we feel or who we think deserves what until it happens to us. And then we start thinking about how can the law be changed or what do we need to do when it enters our own house. And that's the danger of making laws that affect one group. Eventually, those laws end up affecting your group as well. And I think we're seeing a lot of that now just in what's happening in our country. It's not just happening to this group, it's happening to other groups as well.
I just would like to add a reminder that race is a social construction. I'm gonna say that one more time for the people in the back. Race is a social construction. I mean, we got real high tech, black, white. I mean, just from a scientific standpoint, that was something that was created. We created it, we named it. We made it have value. We assigned that value. Because intrinsically, God's known us all since we were in our mother's wombs. And he called us all by name. And he didn't say Black Michelle or White Dan or White Chuck. And we are all created in his image. We created this thing. And so we can, and so I believe that it is conceivable that we can fix it. There's an incredible collective consciousness that would be required, but it is a social construct. And I did not specifically mention that in my talk, but I think that's really important because that's what people say when they hear about these disparities. They infer the wrong, they come to the wrong conclusion. Well, it must be something wrong with them. And in actuality, no, it's something that we've created. But it's so big and it permeates so many different spaces that it's hard for us to see it. And so I think that that's just something that's really important for us to remember when we talk about these things. We created it.
This next question is for Dr. Owens. The issue with infant and infant mortality deaths appear to be more lack of access to providers than lack of access to insurance. How do we get more providers into maternity care deserts?
Oh, so that is a great question. Wow. So I think that there has to be intentionality, and the beauty of this is that I do work on some national organizations that are specifically looking at this, not a Mississippi thing per se, but specifically in rural and underserved areas. Within our specialty, there is a desire to train people specifically with skill sets and a focus on rural health. Within the state of Mississippi, we have a Rural Scholars Program that is kind of designed to help funnel people to rural areas and to take with them not only their clinical skills and expertise, but hopefully the opportunity to create economic development and to bring more into these areas. It's a challenge. I think at least in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the mission used to be that we would bring people to Jackson, train them, and send them back to those spaces that they came from so that they could go back to their communities and serve. And then people sometimes would come and they like it and they stayed. And so more and more, we had more and more people kind of concentrated in these, in the more densely populated areas. And maybe not as many that were as interested because it wasn't, as exciting as sexy to go back to the little small towns. But the need is still there, and I think as we continue to look at innovative ways to kind of attract people to these rural areas and to show them that, number one, they can be economically viable, and two, that there is a need and that they can lend their skills, and also I think going back to community, the concept of community, and the fact that this community needs you and how you can still do that and survive and have a vibrant, full life as a small town doc. I think that people just need to be reminded of that. It's not just about having more than 5 traffic lights and a couple of fast food restaurants and a super Walmart. It's got to be the other things about those spaces that would be attractive to people and to identify those people early and to give them more opportunities to make that commitment earlier on in their training so that they can go back into those communities. I think we should actively recruit for those people, right? Those individuals who say, yeah, I'm one of those folks, that's what I want to do. I want to go back to my small town and take care of the people, who kind of have helped bolster me and get me to this place. But it's not an easy task. But I think that there's work that's being done from workforce development, both locally and nationally, to try to help address the need. The other piece that I think is really important, we didn't really talk a lot about, is going to be including nurse midwives and other non-OBGYN providing people, so not OBGYNs in particular. Love OBGYNs, I'm one, but we can't do it all, and I don't know that we should try. And we know that certified nurse midwives and midwifery can be safe and appropriate, and they provide good care, and they can actually close some of those gaps, especially in low-risk populations, and is very much conducive to more rural settings and areas. As a matter of fact, that's how it used to be done. So I think that including that or expanding the workforce, not necessarily by just bringing in more OBGYNs, but our family practice colleagues who practice obstetrics, certified nurse midwives, and other individuals who can also help in birthing or who are birthing experts, and utilizing them as well would be another way, or at least those are opportunities that I see within the state of Mississippi.
Okay. You have another question. What steps, interventions, screenings are being implemented to address the surge and end of the first year postpartum substance use issues?
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, and this was from the graph where you showed changes in maternal deaths. What steps, interventions, screenings are being implemented to address the surge in the end of first year postpartum substance use issues?
So I'm going to do my best to answer this question. So as it stands, we just completed the expansion of postpartum Medicaid. And if we're trying to couple that or link that with our mortality data, it's a little challenging because the analysis of the mortality data is actually lagging, so that's not real time. As a matter of fact, we just completed, I think, 2021 data. So we are kind of lagging. We've done something in 2022, 23, and we are giving data, because that information will be coming out in the next few months, that will be related to a couple of years ago. So we're out of sync, but there are recommendations that are constantly being made as we are reviewing maternal deaths and as we've continued to see increases. So there are recommendations for policy that would increase or expand access to mental health services that are affordable for women within their first year, and to have more providers that would accept Medicaid as a pay source. Those are recommendations. We can't make people do it. But hopefully, in recognizing that there is this significant need, and maybe even just appealing to the altruistic component of care for people in healthcare, hopefully we can kind of move the needle a little bit. But we are relatively new in that process because those recommendations have come forth from our committee just over the course of the past year. But we've also been working with a couple of other organizations locally to try to see if there are some other things that we could duplicate in other states, or other things that we might be able to recommend that would help to provide more assistance to those individuals who need mental health and substance use services. But I will just say, as a person who treats substance use disorder in pregnancy, I'm just really glad that we actually have the ability to continue the care for women who have started on their road to recovery, motivated by their pregnancy, that they could actually continue that for a year after their babies are born, so that they aren't just kind of cut off right after.
If the political leadership approves Medicaid expansion in early 2024, how long will it take to get it operational? Anybody have an idea? I can tell you it's a process, because they probably will have to do new contracts with some of their providers. They'll have to do the programming in their system so that they can enroll those people, probably at least 6 months.
And, it depends on how we do it. There's all different kind of models of how they've done it. Arkansas tends to be the one. Mississippi, the people in Mississippi, when they look at the places, it's basically the most conservative way to do it that's been done so far. It's Arkansas. So a lot of people look at Arkansas, but there's a lot of different ways to do it. And you look at South Dakota and North Carolina right now. North Carolina finally passed their budget, and they're going to start the process. So you'll have states as recent as this past year and in the past 2 or 3 years to create some good models. So I don't find that to be a huge barrier. The question is, like, how fast can we do it so that we can get the product out there? Yeah. If you're asking that question, we can do it as fast as we can. If it's a question to say, well, I don't know, I mean, that's kind of a smokescreen.
No, I think they were legitimately asking, how quickly can we get it up?
May I offer
Sure.
So my Medicaid expansion is not enough. From the first conversation we had about being here, I have said we have to drive a culture that develops, implements, and demands policy that protects the whole human, serves the whole human. When we play with politicians, they can put the name on anything. And if people don't see themselves as connected or vested in the communities most negatively impacted by whatever the policy is, they will accept something that is expansion in name only. And they'll say, well, you know, I thought we did that last year. And there won't be any meaningful impact in it. So I hope that the people in this room and those watching or listening will embrace that charge. Spend some time in your community getting to know what the challenges look like locally and demand a level of policy engagement, the asking of critical questions, the looking at data, so that you have a sense of just how deep they need to go. Because politics is a strange thing. I bet we can get our brother here to do a real good poll on how we can do it without really doing it.
Yeah. And your answer really goes to the next question. Aside from Medicaid expansion, what are other big things that could change health outcomes in Mississippi? And I bet you have some ideas on that.
So when we look at things that affect health outcomes, we look at the other factors that relate to health. I think one of the biggest things is food insecurity here. So if we could do some things to increase availability of healthy food here for especially people who live below the poverty line, I think that would also do something to improve health outcomes. I think last night we talked about how many children, or maybe it's been today, when Jason showed how many children actually live in poverty. Those are children that also don't have access to healthy food. So if we could do something, and also the other things that have happened since COVID is they have closed a lot of the food pantries now. So because now food that was available is not, we're affecting health outcomes by taking away that nutritious food from children and families that live below the poverty line. So I think that is one thing that we could do to improve health outcomes outside of just expanding Medicaid.
There are a lot of social determinants of health, access to good food. One of the most powerfully predictive is educational attainment. And I'm not talking about health education, I'm talking about English and math. The higher your educational attainment, the better your health outcomes. And this is true in every nation in the world, with one exception, and it's Russia. And I'm not sure why Russia is the exception to that, but the more educated the population is, the better the health outcomes are, and it works at the individual level as well. Mississippi, because of not expanding Medicaid, is underfunding healthcare access. In Mississippi, for years, has also underfunded public education, and funding public education is a strong tool to improve health in Mississippi.
There's one other really, really obvious one, and I think this is important to acknowledge when I talk about the wheel and all the identities and just kind of how they interlock. Pay equity is a really important one because it is like that's not so much about race as much as it is about gender. But when you consider who is head of household, who is caring for the children most, and how much the income, I mean, right, you're impacting poverty, and when you impact poverty, you impact everything else. So that's one that I think is really, really important.
This is an interesting one. In Matthew Desmond's book, Poverty by America, he writes, those who benefit most from government largesse, generally white families with accountants, harbor the strongest anti-government views. Explain this disconnect, and what are your thoughts about these views and its impact specifically in Mississippi? And I'm going to read that quote again. Those who benefit the most from government largesse, generally white families with accountants, harbor the strongest anti-government views.
I've made my staff read that book, so we've been working on it quite a bit. One thing he talks about in particular is the tax write-off we have with our interest on our house, right? If you have a mortgage, at the end of the year, we make sure we make our insurance, not insurance, our interest that we've been paying on our mortgage, we submit that as a tax write-off. It's not a refund, it's a tax deduction. And I think it's like 70% that we get back. That is the federal government giving homeowners federal money. That's exactly what that is. We paid it, and now they are saying we don't have to pay it anymore. That'll go against our taxes, or they will refund us money on the interest that we pay on our houses. We think that's a great idea because people with money should continue to have money. But we are very against housing vouchers. Those same people would be all against poor people or people who experience poverty getting some kind of government subsidy for their housing. To get Section 8 housing right now is like winning a lottery. It takes years to get it. In other words, poor people don't deserve housing help. But people who can afford to buy a house, they do deserve it. And that is a choice we make as a nation. That is a policy that we have in place as a nation. That's how we operate. That's how the system was built. And we can, what would it be like if we all said we won't use a tax deduction on our, we would definitely be against that, right? But we're also against people who are poorer than us getting some kind of benefit like that as well. I think that's one example he gives in the book.
Okay. Oh, he gives another one. Okay. We capitalize profit, but we socialize risk. That doesn't benefit poor folks, right? We should examine the incentive packages that show up, who gets them, where they are. Do they even honor the commitments they make for job creation? That's how we got here, and more of the same will keep us where we are.
Okay, a check. We're at our scheduled stopping point, but we still have questions. Do you in general want to go on, or are you ready? Are y'all okay going ahead?
We'll close our eyes so our feelings aren't hurt by who leaves.
I just felt like I needed to check in. Yes. And I think that's okay. Explain why these types of comments are unhelpful, and I'm sure you've all heard them. They can go to the emergency room if they want, and they won't be turned away. They even go for sore throats and colds.
Well, it's unhelpful because there's a cost associated not only to the person who goes to the emergency room, but to the taxpayer. So we say we don't want to pay for these things, but when someone uses the emergency room, the hospital still has to supply the doctors, the nurses, the healthcare staff, and they still have to pay for it. And that's that uncompensated care that hospitals do not receive when they provide emergency services and they are not paid for them, which results in what? All these hospitals closing because they cannot afford to operate. Hospitals are businesses.
And it is the most expensive type of outpatient care you can receive in the healthcare system. So
it's cheaper to go get a room at the Westin and to call Uber and have them pick up something from Walgreens and bring it up to your room and stay the night than it is for you to go to the emergency department to get treated for your sore throat.
That is absolutely true.
You could even get the deluxe room at the Westin.
And the Uber driver staying with you too, right?
Are there resources available to assist and positively impact problems addressed, such as poverty in Mississippi? Are there resources available to assist and make a positive impact on those?
I think when we're talking about poverty, we are more talking about the things that influence the development of poverty. So when you say resources, it can be something like the Wynn Job Center is working to address poverty because they're trying to get people employed. When we talk about temporary assistance, that's also helping to address poverty because it's temporarily helping people. If we talk about helping daycare centers to be able to open and operate so that that mother can go to work every day, that's addressing poverty. So I don't think when we say address poverty, there's going to be some magic amount of money that's going to be given to someone. But when you provide those resources to enable them to do the things to promote their own generation of income, generation of wealth, you're addressing poverty. You had to think about it.
What is the correlation between the age of a mother and infant mortality? Or is there?
So, so there are definite increased risks that exist the further along in your reproductive age that you go. As by convention, we use the cutoff of the age of 35 as the lower limit of what we would call advanced maternal age. And for those of you who want to boo advanced maternal age, it's way better than elderly gravida. Just saying. Terminology is a work in progress. We're working on sensitive language here. But so there are increased risks for things like chromosome problems and issues related to stillbirths and those kinds of things that are associated with advanced maternal age. And so basically, the further down the road you go, the more riskier things tend to be. And that is just because when we are little babies that come into the world, every woman has all of the eggs that she's ever going to have. Let that sink in, which I think is kind of cool because that means that our babies are always with us from the very beginning, which is kind of neat. But so the further down the road you go, yes. Now, as it pertains to what we know are the leading causes of infant mortality, that's a little different. So I think the top three are going to be preterm birth. And so we know that women of advanced maternal age, so at the extremes of maternal age, so really, really young moms and our older moms are at increased risk for preterm birth. And then the next would be birth defects or structural malformations. The risk for chromosome problems goes up, and when you have chromosome problems, those are more commonly associated with certain birth defects. So that can be one. But the other one that's huge is SIDS. And that one is not exactly tied to maternal age in the same way. And we do see disparities that exist there. A lot of that has to do with some cultural norms. But safe sleep is very low-hanging fruit when we talk about reduction in SIDS rates. Another thing that is very important is smoking, and just basically deciding not to do that. And if you decrease smoking, then SIDS rates go down with moms who don't smoke as compared to those that are born or that live in smoking environments. So those are just a few of the correlations that exist. But this is, our infant mortality issue is not just tied to issues related to maternal age. And for all those women who are lucky enough to be blessed with children at the age of 35 and beyond, that is not something that needs to be, it is not like it's the scarlet letter. It is not something you have to be exceptionally fearful about, and it is not like you've done something wrong. There are plenty of women who are 35 and over who have very healthy and safe pregnancies, but there are things that that we do need to kind of keep an eye on and look out for in that population that may occur with greater frequency than in younger mothers or less life experienced mothers.
Well, I want to thank all of our speakers for everything you've done this weekend, and I'm sure you want to show your appreciation. Look. Absolutely. Okay.
Would you like to ask the question, Doctor? Yeah. Yeah.
The opponents of Medicaid expansion seem to stress, well, there's a tension about gospel between moral piety and social responsibility. Not necessarily a tension, but a dual imperative, right? And it appears that the opponents of Medicaid expansion demonize the advocates by associating with them with people who may be of less moral piety in their minds, the baby killers, the LGBTQ community, the advocates of porn in San Francisco, et cetera. So washing the advocates with this broad brush. Much of our Christian base in Mississippi is theologically to the right of center, and, you know, the Protestant denominations that are very preoccupied with moral piety issues. How would you counsel a lawmaker, Reverend Poole, to balance that out or to reconsider?
Yeah. I think that this is going to sound like, not only will it sound like it will be an overly simplistic answer to a very, very important question, but I would say to them that if they want to root their position in I'll say our religion, because Mississippi and Alabama, annually vie for the buckle on the Bible Belt. The two states with the highest concentration of Christians or persons who identify as Christians. Then, as simplistic as this sounds, my honest to God, my deathbed answer would be that you need to rediscover, if you're going to root your position in a moral ground, and you are a Christian, then you need to rediscover the Jesus of the four Gospels, because the Jesus of the four Gospels is not the I-20 Jesus who owns most of the religious landscape between Atlanta and Dallas. And nothing could be more incongruous with the Jesus of the four Gospels than that the two states, and I'll name Mississippi and Alabama because Marcia and I lived here for 27 years, and now we've been living in Birmingham for 6 months, that the two states which annually vie for buckle on the Bible Belt are among the 10 states which have yet to take substantive action to bridge the health care coverage gap, is the ultimate incongruity. And I think, though, that what we've done, and when I say we, I include myself in it because I've been a pastor in the American South for 45 years. what we've done is we've allowed popular culture to redefine Jesus and Christianity. And so we end up with a situation, a circumstance, a great and grievous sadness, where statistically the most Christian states in the nation are spiritually, in some ways, not always, but in some ways, the furthest from the spirit of the Jesus of the four Gospels. And do y'all remember that song by Jim Croce about Willie McCoy? I'm a pool shooting boy by the name of Willie McCoy. Back home they call me Slim, and then he loses all his money in the pool game. You remember that? And he comes back the next week. You remember? And he says, "It may sound funny, but I've come to get my money back." Well, it may sound funny, but I've come to get my Jesus back. And I think that politicians who see themselves as Christians and who claim the name of Christ, I think have to be asked to read the four Gospels. And to me, and I know that's overly simplistic, but to me it goes to what Vaughn was talking about earlier, that even Medicaid expansion itself, if you set it out here on a limb by itself, is not really the answer to what we're talking about. The answer to what we're talking about, and I mean I say this inside the church because this is a church meeting, the answer to what we're talking about is helping people who claim the name of Christ to actually, be called upon to say that what Jesus said matters most. The Bible Belt, has become the ballot belt, and so we sort of vote en masse in ways that are distant from the Spirit of Jesus. Otherwise, this wouldn't be the most difficult part of the world in which to be a gay or lesbian or transgender person. If we were all embodying the Spirit of Jesus, people in New York and San Francisco who have gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender children would be telling them to move to Jackson and Birmingham, where everybody would be so welcoming and kind, because that's where most of the Christians are. So we've lost that, and I don't know how to fix that. But if I was in a conversation with a legislator about the moral and, to be specific, Christian dimensions of this conversation, that's what I would say to them.
Thank you so much. Guys, show them some love. Wow. This has been marvelous, and your participation in this has made it marvelous. A friend asked me a moment ago, what's the takeaway from this? Is it information or transformation? Yes. You have been equipped with critical information, particularly around what it is said to be the basic issue in the upcoming elections. Transformationally, my prayer for myself and for the churches that I pastor is that God would give and create within us a Christ-centered social conscience that allows us to look at these issues through different lenses and to speak into those issues with a different voice. I hope if you'd like more of this, you'll come see us tomorrow at 11 o'clock when Chuck will be speaking. He was just holding back there. I'm going to ask my friend David McCoy to close us.
Praise God. Let's give the panel another hand. I'd also, before we close, I think I would be remiss if I didn't ask those in the committee, if there are any on the committee, the T.W. Lewis Lecture Committee that are here, would you stand, please? Thank you, Susan. Our leader, Carrie Stockett. Also, I would like to take a moment to say that our God is a God of both and, not either or. And we've had a lot of information here, and I think we just need to take a moment to decompress. In order to do that, and we're getting ready to get on the highway or go to wherever your next appointment or call is, I would like you to just follow me, if you would, in this centering prayer. And how it goes is we would say, we would close our eyes, and then we would breathe in, Lord Jesus, Son of God, have mercy, and breathe out. Now, you can do that on the in or the out, but I'd like you to do it 3 times, and I will give you an example of that. I would breathe, Lord Jesus, Son of God, have mercy. Lord Jesus, Son of God, have mercy. Would you try that with me, please? And we're going to do it 3 times. And you're decompressing. What is God called us to do as he's worked among us these last few hours, yesterday and today, and even in tomorrow as we go to worship service? Carrie just mentioned that we should have a new way of thinking, a new narrative, a way of creating vocabulary and terminology that would allow us to share what we've learned here. So let's try that with me, please, a decompressing, centering prayer. Would you do it with me? Lord Jesus, Son of God, have mercy. Lord Jesus, Son of God, have mercy. Lord Jesus, Son of God, have mercy. Lord, as we close this meeting out, we hope that we've said something or done something that is pleasing to you. Lord, we have many complex issues in our society, but we recognize that our greatest call is to be one as you are one with the Father. So, Lord, we'd like you to touch everyone here in their heart, in their mind, their body, their spirit. It's a cumulative thing that we're trying to do, Lord, to get us to understand that we need each other, that we must love one another. And so, Lord, we turn all this over to you. Academics is not enough. Mental gymnastics is not enough. Providing food shelters and food closets and food clothes closets and food pantries is not enough. We must take them in as our brothers and sisters and make them as much as you've blessed us with, that we bless them with. The other, Lord. All of creation belongs to you. Lord, help us to let someone know that they're loved and they're cared about, that we're here to nurture them as you've nurtured us. And so we offer this prayer as we leave and go our way, Lord. Would you please give us protection as we drive the highways, the dangerous highways and byways? Would you allow us to find all things well when we reach our destination? Hear this now, Lord, a prayer that we would hope that would disturb us, that would change us. Disturb us, Lord, when with the abundance of things we possess, we have lost our thirst for life, for the waters of life. Having fallen in love with life, we have ceased to dream of eternity. And in our efforts to build a new earth, we have allowed our vision of a new heaven to dim. Disturb us, Lord, to dare more boldly, to venture on wider seas, where storms will show your mastery. Where losing sight of land, we shall find the stars. We ask you to push back the horizons of our hopes and to push into the future in strength, courage, hope, and in love. And we ask all things in Jesus' name and for his sake. Would you say with me, amen, amen, and amen. God bless you. You're dismissed.
So good to be with you. Thank you for your words.
God bless you, young man.
Thank you.
God bless you. Thank you, young man.